The morning alarm pierced through the thin walls of the small apartment at 5:30, just as it had every day for the past 8 years. Marcus Williams rolled out of bed, his joints protesting against another day of hard labor ahead. The mirror reflected a man in his 40s, weathered by years of physical work, but his eyes still held something that poverty and struggle had failed to extinguish: hope. Marcus worked at the old textile factory on the outskirts of Riverside, a neighborhood that had seen better days. The paint peeled from most houses, the streets were cracked and uneven, and many families struggled to make ends meet. Yet this was home, and Marcus had never considered leaving. This was where he belonged, where his heart was rooted, and where he believed God had placed him for a purpose he was still discovering. As he prepared his simple breakfast of toast and coffee, Marcus glanced at the small wooden cross hanging on his kitchen wall. It had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had taught him that wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the love you shared with others. "Every morning is a gift, Marcus," she used to say. "Use it to be someone's blessing." Those words had become his daily prayer, his guiding light through the darkest times. The walk to the factory took 20 minutes through streets that told stories of struggle and resilience. Marcus passed Mrs. Chen's corner store, where the elderly woman was already arranging fresh vegetables despite her arthritic hands. He waved and she smiled back, a gesture that had become part of their morning ritual. Further down, he saw young Tommy Rodriguez waiting for the school bus, his shoes held together with duct tape, his lunch bag noticeably thin. At the factory, Marcus joined the familiar rhythm of machines and conversations. His co-workers were good people, each carrying their own burdens, their own dreams deferred by economic reality. There was James, a single father raising 3 children after his wife left. Sarah, who worked double shifts to pay for her mother's medical treatments. And Miguel, an immigrant sending most of his earnings back to his family in another country. During lunch break, Marcus sat alone as usual, not out of antisocial tendencies, but because he used this time for quiet reflection and prayer. He would close his eyes and ask for strength, not just for himself but for everyone around him. He prayed for wisdom to know how he could help, even when his own resources were so limited. That particular Tuesday started like any other, but it would become the day that changed everything. As Marcus walked home from work, he noticed Mrs. Chin struggling to lift a heavy box of supplies into her store. Without hesitation, he crossed the street to help her. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, slightly out of breath. "My son usually helps, but he's working late again." "No problem at all, Mrs. Chin. How's business?" The elderly woman's face clouded over. "Not so good. The rent went up again and fewer people have money to spend. I don't know how much longer I can keep the store open." Marcus felt a familiar tug in his heart, the same feeling he got whenever he encountered someone in need. That evening he sat at his small kitchen table, looking at his modest savings account statement. He had been putting aside small amounts for months, hoping to eventually fix his old car or maybe take a small vacation. But as he thought about Mrs. Chen's worried face, he knew what he had to do. The next morning Marcus stopped by the store before work. "Mrs. Chen, I was thinking, what if I helped you with some of the heavy lifting in the evenings? And maybe I could spread the word about your store, encourage more neighbors to shop here." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "Marcus, you already work so hard. I couldn't ask you to do more." "You're not asking. I'm offering. We're neighbors, we're family. That's what family does." That evening, Marcus spent 2 hours helping Mrs. Chen reorganize her store, making it more welcoming and efficient. He also had an idea. Using his small savings, he bought ingredients and prepared simple sandwiches, which Mrs. Chen agreed to sell at a small profit. The sandwiches became popular with factory workers looking for an affordable, hearty lunch. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about Marcus's sandwiches and his efforts to help Mrs. Chen. People began shopping at her store more frequently, not just for the food but because they wanted to support someone who was supporting others. But Marcus's acts of kindness were just beginning. When he learned that young Tommy Rodriguez was walking to school in shoes that barely protected his feet, Marcus used part of his next paycheck to buy the boy a new pair of sneakers. He left them anonymously on the family's doorstep with a note that simply said, "Every child deserves to walk with dignity." Tommy's mother, Maria, was overwhelmed with gratitude. She had been working 3 part-time jobs but still couldn't afford new shoes for her son. The anonymous gift restored her faith that good people still existed in the world. Inspired by this kindness, she began volunteering at the local community center, helping other struggling families navigate social services and find resources. At the factory, Marcus noticed that James, the single father, often looked exhausted and stressed. During their lunch breaks, Marcus began sharing his sandwiches with James, insisting he had made too much food. He also offered to help James with his children on weekends, teaching them to play basketball at the local park while James caught up on rest or household chores. James was initially reluctant to accept help, his pride making it difficult to admit he was struggling. But Marcus's gentle persistence and genuine care gradually broke down those barriers. "You're not taking charity," Marcus told him. "You're accepting love from a friend who wants to see you succeed." The basketball games at the park became a neighborhood event. Other children joined in and soon parents were gathering to watch and socialize. The park, which had been neglected and rarely used, became a hub of community activity. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years without speaking began forming friendships. Sarah, the woman working double shifts for her mother's medical bills, was the next person touched by Marcus's expanding circle of kindness. When he learned about her situation, Marcus organized a small fundraiser among the factory workers. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to cover 1 month of her mother's medication. More importantly, it showed Sarah that she wasn't alone in her struggle. Moved by the support she received, Sarah used her nursing background to start a small health clinic in her home, offering basic medical care to neighbors who couldn't afford to see a doctor. She charged only what people could afford, sometimes accepting payment in the form of home-cooked meals or help with household repairs. Miguel, the immigrant worker, was struggling to learn English, which limited his job opportunities. Marcus, despite his own limited education, offered to practice English with Miguel during their lunch breaks. Soon, other co-workers joined these informal lessons, creating a supportive learning environment that helped Miguel gain confidence and eventually qualify for a better position at the factory. Grateful for the help he received, Miguel began teaching Spanish to neighborhood children, including Tommy Rodriguez, helping them connect with their cultural heritage while developing valuable language skills. The language exchange became another community-building activity that brought people together across cultural lines. As weeks turned into months, the transformation in Riverside became undeniable. Mrs. Chen's store was thriving, becoming a gathering place where neighbors shared news and supported each other. The park was alive with children's laughter and community events. Sarah's informal health clinic was helping dozens of families access basic medical care. Miguel's language classes were building bridges between different cultural communities. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the people themselves. The sense of hopelessness that had once pervaded the neighborhood was being replaced by something powerful, the belief that they could make a difference in each other's lives. Marcus continued his quiet acts of service, never seeking recognition or praise. When elderly Mr. Patterson's roof began leaking, Marcus organized a group of neighbors to help with repairs. When the community center needed volunteers for a children's after-school program, Marcus was among the first to sign up, despite his long work days. His example inspired others to look for ways they could help. James began mentoring other single fathers in the neighborhood. Maria Rodriguez started a small food pantry in her garage, collecting donations to help families facing food insecurity. Even the teenagers, including Tommy, began volunteering at the community center and helping elderly neighbors with grocery shopping and household tasks. The ripple effects of Marcus's kindness reached far beyond what he could have imagined. A local newspaper heard about the transformation in Riverside and wrote a feature story about the community's renewal. The article caught the attention of a nonprofit organization that provided grants for community development projects. Riverside received a substantial grant to renovate the community center, improve the park, and start a small business incubator program. Mrs. Chen's store became the anchor for a small commercial district that attracted other businesses, creating jobs and economic opportunities for residents. But for Marcus, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition or the visible improvements to the neighborhood. It was the transformation he saw in people's faces, the hope that had returned to their eyes, the way neighbors now looked out for each other as family. One evening, as Marcus walked home from the factory, he was approached by a group of neighborhood children, including Tommy Rodriguez, who was now wearing his second pair of new shoes, purchased with money his mother had saved thanks to the community support network. "Mr. Marcus," Tommy said, his voice filled with excitement, "we want to do something nice for you. You've done so much for everyone." Marcus knelt down to the boy's level, his heart full of emotion. "Tommy, seeing you and your friends happy and healthy, seeing our neighborhood become a place where people care for each other, that's the greatest gift I could ever receive." But the children had already made their plans. The next Saturday, Marcus arrived at the park to find the entire community gathered for a surprise celebration in his honor. There were homemade decorations, food prepared by dozens of families, and a banner that read, Thank you, Marcus, for showing us the power of love. Mrs. Chen stood up to address the crowd, her voice strong despite her age. Marcus taught us that we don't need to be rich to be generous. We don't need to have everything to share what we have. He showed us that the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest miracles. James spoke next, his 3 children standing proudly beside him. Marcus didn't just help me with my kids or share his lunch with me. He helped me remember that accepting help doesn't make you weak. It makes you part of a community. Sarah, whose mother's health had improved thanks to the community support and better access to care, shared her gratitude. Marcus showed us that when we take care of each other, we all become stronger. His kindness gave me the courage to use my skills to help others. Miguel, now fluent in English and working as a supervisor at the factory, spoke about how Marcus's friendship had changed his life. In my country we have a saying, "A candle loses nothing by lighting another candle." Marcus lit so many candles in our community that now the whole neighborhood glows with hope. As the celebration continued into the evening, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the love and gratitude surrounding him. He thought about his grandmother's words, "Use every morning to be someone's blessing." He had tried to live by those words, never imagining that his small acts of kindness would create such profound change. But the story was far from over. The transformation in Riverside had caught the attention of other struggling communities, and delegations began visiting to learn about their model of neighbor helping neighbor. Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into a leadership role, speaking at community meetings and sharing the simple principles that had guided his actions. It's not about being perfect, he would tell these groups. It's about being present. It's about seeing the person in front of you and asking, "How can I help?" It's about believing that every act of kindness, no matter how small, plants a seed that will grow into something beautiful. The factory where Marcus worked also took notice of the positive changes in their workforce. Morale was higher, absenteeism was down, and productivity had increased. The company decided to implement a community service program, giving employees paid time off to volunteer in their neighborhoods. Marcus was asked to help coordinate the program, a role that allowed him to expand his impact even further. Years passed, and Riverside became known as a model community, a place where people from different backgrounds came together to support each other. Property values increased, but long-time residents weren't displaced because the community had created affordable housing initiatives and cooperative ownership programs. Mrs. Chen's store had expanded into a small market that employed several neighborhood residents. The community center offered job training programs, childcare services, and health clinics. The park hosted festivals and farmers markets that brought visitors from across the city. Tommy Rodriguez, now a teenager, had become a leader among the youth in the community. He started a peer mentoring program for younger children and was planning to attend college on a scholarship he earned through his community service work. "Mr. Marcus showed me that being poor doesn't mean being powerless," he said. "He taught me that I can make a difference right where I am." But perhaps the most profound change was in Marcus himself. The quiet factory worker had discovered that his purpose wasn't just to work and survive, but to be an instrument of hope and transformation in the lives of others. His faith had deepened through witnessing the miracles that emerged from simple acts of love. One Sunday morning, Marcus stood before the congregation at the small neighborhood church that had also experienced renewal thanks to the community's transformation. He had been asked to share his testimony, something that would have terrified him years earlier. "I used to think that because I didn't have much money or education, there wasn't much I could do to help others," he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "But I learned that God doesn't need us to be rich or powerful to use us for good. He just needs us to be willing." He looked out at the faces in the congregation, many of them neighbors whose lives had been touched by the chain of kindness that had started with his simple decision to help Mrs. Chen with a heavy box. "Every morning when I wake up, I remember my grandmother's words, 'Use this day to be someone's blessing.' I've learned that when we bless others, we ourselves are blessed in ways we never expected. When we plant seeds of kindness, we harvest fields of joy." The congregation was silent, moved by the sincerity and power of his words. Marcus continued, "The miracles we've seen in our community didn't happen because one person did something extraordinary. They happened because ordinary people decided to do ordinary acts of kindness with extraordinary love." After the service, Marcus walked through the streets of Riverside, marveling at the transformation that had taken place. Children played safely in clean parks. Neighbors chatted on front porches. Small businesses thrived. Gardens bloomed in once vacant lots. But the most beautiful sight was the way people looked at each other, with respect, with care, with the recognition that they were all part of something larger than themselves. They had learned that a community is not just a place where people live near each other, but a place where people choose to live for each other. As Marcus reached his apartment, he paused to look at the wooden cross hanging in his kitchen, the same cross that had belonged to his grandmother. He whispered a prayer of gratitude not just for the blessings he had received, but for the opportunity to be a blessing to others. That night, as he prepared for bed, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a simple choice to help an elderly woman with a heavy box. It had continued with a decision to share his lunch with a struggling coworker, to buy shoes for a child in need, to offer his time and energy to anyone who needed it. Each act of kindness had seemed small and insignificant at the time. But together they had created something magnificent, a community transformed by love, a neighborhood where hope had replaced despair, where people had learned that they were stronger together than they could ever be alone. Marcus understood now that this was what his grandmother had meant when she spoke about being someone's blessing. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic acts. It was about the daily choice to see others as family, to respond to need with generosity, to believe that love is always stronger than fear. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new chances to plant seeds of kindness that would grow into forests of hope. He had learned that miracles don't always come from heaven in dramatic displays of divine power. Sometimes they emerge from the simple decision of ordinary people to love their neighbors as themselves. The story of Riverside had become a testament to a profound truth, that in a world often marked by division and despair, small acts of kindness performed with great love have the power to transform communities, heal hearts, and remind us all that we are connected by something greater than our individual struggles. Marcus Williams, the humble factory worker who barely made ends meet, had discovered that he possessed something more valuable than money or status: the ability to see the divine spark in every person he met and the courage to fan that spark into flame through acts of selfless love. And in learning to be a blessing to others, he had found that he himself had been blessed beyond measure, not with material wealth, but with something far more precious: the knowledge that his life had meaning, that his presence in the world made a difference, and that love, when shared freely and generously, multiplies exponentially, creating miracles that echo through generations. The transformation of Riverside continued long after Marcus's story became known throughout the city. Other communities began implementing similar programs, creating networks of mutual support and care. The model spread from neighborhood to neighborhood, city to city, proving that the principles Marcus had lived by were not unique to one place or one person, but universal truths about the power of human kindness and community solidarity. Years later, when visitors came to Riverside to study their success, they would often ask what made the difference, what was the secret to their transformation. The answer was always the same. It started with one person who decided that love was more important than comfort, that service was more valuable than security, and that the smallest acts of kindness, when performed with faith and consistency, could indeed change the world. Marcus Williams had learned that he didn't need to be wealthy to be generous, didn't need to be powerful to be influential, and didn't need to be perfect to be used by God for good. He had discovered that the greatest miracles often begin with the simplest acts of love, and that when we choose to be instruments of hope in the lives of others, we ourselves become living testimonies to the transformative power of faith, kindness, and community.